Guys, today we'll be going into a little bit about what exactly SLMN does and what exactly you guys will be doing, hopefully during conference, right? So let's straightway dive into it. Let's dive into Sri Lanka Model United Nations, the 17th session. So first and foremost, you might be asking, right? What exactly is SLMN, right? So SLMN, ladies and gentlemen, is essentially an organization, right, where we partner up essentially with practically everything within Sri Lanka to make what we know as Sri Lanka Model United Nations. Now, I know that might sound very confusing, but in the grand scheme of things, we are quite literally the largest organization in Sri Lanka that simulates what we know as Model United Nations, which is something I will get into in a little bit, right? So I'm not going to get into too much about what we do, but essentially, in very simple terms, I would say SLMUN is essentially a bit different than what you might know from anything abroad, right? So there are certain conferences and certain types of MUN that first and foremost originated in other countries and so on and so forth. And it's something that obviously our country is adopted as well. But SLMUN is a very different kind of organization. As you might have noticed, some of you guys might be here from, I believe, Badulla, Nuwara, and like several other areas within Sri Lanka itself. That's because of Sri Lanka Model United Nations reach, right? Several years ago, when we were just a tad bit smaller, we weren't necessarily able to interact with people like you, for an example, actually. Um, because obviously we were a growing organization, our goals were noble. However, it took time to get to this point. But Sri Lanka Model United Nations is now one of the largest organizations in Southeast Asia, where we, in very simple terms, engage in international debates and so on and so forth on pressing issues that the world faces. And to me, just a small little story about me and like how SLMN has been to me. It's kind of something that's it's a very first and foremost, it's a very important part of my life. I'll admit that here and now. And secondly, it's something that honestly allowed me to grow as a person. It gave me the ability to speak to you right here and right now without being as nervous. I'm a little bit nervous, but it basically gave me an opportunity to come up, raise my placard, get recognized, and speak out against my fears of speaking in public, and so on and so forth. And that's the greatest part. It's something that people from across the country, like you guys, are now able to participate in, right? And it's gives you that kind of opportunity, not only to just be able to get over your fears and so on and so forth, but to honestly make social interactions and just honestly make friends along the way, right? So I'm not going to yap too much about this. I hope to see you guys there at SLMN, so you'll know exactly what I mean when I stated my own little story about it, right? So what exactly is MUN now? Now we covered what SLMUN is in very brief terms, but what exactly is MUN, right? So, but before that, as per the presentations, we quickly go through what exactly we're going to discuss today. So the first few things that we're going to discuss is actually MUN procedure, which is very crucial to understand when you actually go into debate, when you go into conference, just so that you can get a grasp of, okay, how exactly does MUN work? Like, how do we proceed on with our events within particular committees, right? So we'll be discussing about MUN procedure. We'll be discussing about foreign policy statements. We'll be discussing about working papers and how exactly you can research in MUN. Now, what exactly is MUN? I know I kind of ranted on a little bit, guys, but what exactly is MUN? So MUN, ladies and gentlemen, is kind of a platform where we simulate what we know as the United Nations, right? So the United Nations essentially is an organization that was created actually after what you guys might know of, known as the League of Nations. It's essentially its descendant, if you would, right? The whole point of the United Nations was basically it was created to achieve world peace and stability and just maintain order, right? And obviously, as you guys know, the United Nations has been very crucial in key events, as you guys may know of. And it's a very crucial part of foreign affairs of practically every single nation, even our own nation, as we know it. So, model United Nations, which is what we as SLMian do, Model United Nations is essentially simulating that experience that the United Nations has, right? So the United Nations essentially has several committees, if you would, several groups, if you would, basically groups called committees. These groups, known as committees, discuss various different topics, various different various different topics with regards to international affairs and so on and so forth. For an example, there are certain committees that are focused towards health, which you guys might have heard of during COVID-19, such as WHO, WHA, and there are also certain other committees simulated in the actual United Nations with regards to security, right? That security includes things like the Security Council, honestly, which is a very crucial organization within the United Nations. But I'm not going to bore you guys too much on that. Just know that MUN and what we do is essentially kind of mimicking what the actual United Nations does and the various different aspects and topics that the United Nations discusses. So now that you know what exactly MUN is, right? Oh yeah, apologies, I forgot to mention the way in which we also simulate the United Nations itself is that each and every one of you who happen to be there at conference actually will get to represent a nation just like in the United Nations. For an example, let's say I am representing the nation of USA, right? So I am going to be recognized as the delegate of USA. So practically each and every one of you who will be there at conference will be recognized as delegates of your respective nation, which is very simply being a representative, right? So that's in very simple terms what MUN is about. Now we move on to procedure 1 and so on and so forth, which I believe Himanshu will be discussing. All right. Thank you so much, guys.
Okay, so basically, how procedure works is this. There's different steps that you need to follow before you get into certain parts of debate, right? So the very first thing that you do when you walk into committee is this thing called a motion to move into roll call. How do we bring up things like motions? Because like it's something that's going to be brought up again and again. But just the general thing is that to bring up things like points and different motions, you raise your placard, which is like this basically like it's a piece of cardboard that has your country and your flag and everything, and that's the main way that you get recognized throughout committee, right? So you raise your placard up and you ask for a motion, right? So the way that MUN, at least SLMUN works, is we follow a very strict like pathway, right? That like a list of motions that we follow that end up leading to like different points of debate. So the first motion is the motion to move into roll call. I'm sure most of you already know understand what this means, but basically throughout this motion, um, and I forgot to mention this, but motions often have to go through a voting procedure, right? And these are parliamentary votes. So so all procedural votes need to have like all delegates raising their placards either for or against a motion being enacted upon. Right? There's no abstentions, so which means you have to raise your placard either for or against. But the motion to move into roll call is quite simple. Basically, you raise a motion to move into roll call, and then you have the voting procedure. Then after that, if you do have a majority, which you should have a majority, you then move into roll call. In roll call, all you need to do is this. You raise your placard up, and then you basically the chair or the head table recognizes you, and then you need to say present and voting, right? This is important, like that, especially the last part of it when it comes to the voting part of it, because not all nations have equal ability to do things like vote. For example, take for example the state of Palestine. The state of Palestine technically within the UN has a inability to like since they have only observer status within the UN, they haven't been granted voter status. Similarly, there are other countries such as there are other nations such as the Vatican City, for example, which similarly do not have voting rights. So, in the instance that you do gain one of these countries that doesn't have voting rights, all you need to do is say present. You don't need to say present and voting. But for the sake of like all other nations, which is going to be a vast majority of you, all you need to say is present and voting, right? Then the chair will note your presence and like you sit down. That's all you need to do. But we do this for every single person that's there in committee, but it's generally a way of checking attendance. Next is the motion to set the agenda. So the agenda is the topic that you are discussing today, right? So at PD, the practice debates, you will have one topic. At conference, you will have another topic. All you need to do in this, and again, you go through the voting procedure, right? You go through the voting procedure to pass the agenda, and then you basically read out the agenda, right? You read out the topic that you are discussing today, and then you go into voting on that agenda. So why we do voting on agenda is like a few reasons. Firstly, in the instance that this is an already heavily discussed topic, delegates tend to have the like in the actual UN, you have the ability to either object or you have the ability to second the discussion of this agenda. Generally speaking, and this is what is highly recommended from the executive committee, do not vote against the agenda, because there's only two real reasons why you would vote against an agenda. And the first reason being that it's way out of mandate. Like, so I'll be going on to explain what mandate really is, but mandate, just in broad terms, is the jurisdiction of a committee, which means that the things that they do, the topics that they can talk about. And generally speaking, the head tables of your of SLMUN will generally have topics which are within the mandate. So don't worry about that, but just know that there is a voting procedure, and those are the only grounds of objection, that it's severely out of mandate. Then the head table will adopt the agenda based off like if there is a significant amount of if there is a simple majority in that votes that seconds the passing of the agenda. Then we move on to the motion to discuss working papers. I believe Randir will be going on to explain about like how the working papers actually work and what they are. But basically, this is one of the three documents that you will need to submit before SLMN and before your practice debate. That basically you will be discussing and presenting. The working paper is arguably the most important document that you submit to SLMUN, to your head table before conference. But after voting on it, then either the chairs will open, so the head table will either open the floor for delegates to raise their placards and sign themselves up to have their working papers discussed, or the chairs will select from the list of delegates who have submitted working papers. After that, when the delegate has his working paper openly presented, he or she will give a speech. on the top on the working paper and the different aspects that the working paper covers, right? So after that speech is given, so this speech will last for roughly about a minute, and in that time, the delegate should be able to explain his working paper and all the like constituent aspects of it and all the things that they wish to cover within that speech. Then the head table opens the floor for points of information. So before the head table opens the floor for points of information generally, and these are not motions per se, these are just steps that you follow. But the head table will ask the delegate if the delegate is open to points of information. At this point, the delegate has a few options. Either you limit the number of points of information, or you say any and all. Any and all means that you are open to any number of points of information, and it'll be under the discretion of the head table how many points of information they wish to allocate to this specific delegate, right? So after that, again, if you want to ask a point of information, any points, right? You raise your placard, and then you raise your placard, and the chairs will recognize you, right? So basically, a POI can be broken up into two parts. Right? You have your initial POI, and then you have follow-up, right? So a follow-up is basically like a POI is, just to be clear, a POI is a question which you ask in regards to something that the delegate said. Right? This can be asking about whether they support a certain solution, or whether they like about a question about their working paper. Anything related to the speech that they just gave, you can ask a question about. Right? So then the follow-up then is a similarly related question to the POI that you asked, which is just an add-on question that supplements that question with like another response. But yeah, Randhu, can you go to the next slide? Sure. Okay. So these are the other points that you can raise, right? So in SLMUN, we entertain multiple different points. The first one is the permission to make a statement. So a statement is like basically this. A statement is a very, very short speech, probably like 20 seconds, 20-second speech on a very particular topic that you feel the need to talk about. So generally speaking, what these statements, like the content of these statements is probably something like it differs. You could be proposing a solution. You could be calling out like problems within another delegate solutions. You can be pointing out things like hypocrisy, etc. But the point of a statement is to give yourself an ability to speak out about something that another delegate said beyond just asking questions, right? So it's a very short speech to basically voice out your opinions or voice out a particular type of like a solution that you see could fix the problem that the delegate has mentioned within their speech, right? This is not dependent on their response, but it is like unlike a POI, but you can make an independent statement. So when you raise a point of permission to make a statement, basically speaking, you ask for a statement, and the chairs will ask you what grounds, right? What are the grounds of your statement? The grounds of your statement are simple. All you need to do is tell me what the main point of your statement is, basically saying. So let's say I'm asking for permission to make a statement, and I want to make a statement pointing out the hypocrisy of delegate A. All I need to say is, Your Honor, permission to make a statement, and then they'll ask me on what grounds. On the grounds of the sheer hypocrisy of delegate A in proposing solution X. Right, that's all I need to say. It's very short, very simple, very to the point. You don't need to give your entire speech when we're asking you what are the grounds of your statement. But basically, this is a method for the head table to know exactly what you want to say, and therefore either accept or deny your speech or deny your statement based off whether they believe that it'll be helpful to debate and whether they have like the necessary time to entertain your speech. But that's basically all it is. It's a very short speech that you give to voice out a certain opinion on a certain matter, right? The second point then is right to advise. Right to replies are broken down into three parts. Okay, so you have foreign policy violations, factual errors, and infringements of sovereignty. I'll start with the first one because they're going to be the most common ones you see. But foreign policy violations, simply put, is when a nation violates its own foreign policy. I'm sure we've explained to you what foreign policy is already at the other workshops, but um, in the in-person workshops, but I'll go on to detail on what foreign policy is shortly. So foreign policy, simply put, is just how a nation interacts with the rest of the world. This means their stances on certain matters, their their stances on certain matters, their approaches to certain things, what their legal documentation says they can and cannot do, what basically, if a nation, a real nation, like a delegate of the UN, the actual UN, is put to the task of making a decision, what that decision will be. Again, as I stated, this is dependent on certain things, a country's constitution, for example. And when we're talking about like how to do better research, we'll explain why things like the constitution are like extremely important. Things like the conventions and the laws that they've signed, things like the acts, the treaties, but also things like their past actions, things like their current financial commitments, things like the things that the head of state has said, right? All these things culminate to form foreign policy. The point at which a delegate within their speech or in a response to a POI, for example, violates their foreign policy, all you need to do is say, Your Honor, permission to, Your Honor, right to reply based off foreign policy violation. When a nation is acting uncharacteristic of of what is expected of their nation, that is then a foreign policy violation. It is quite simple. But you have to be very careful when it comes to the difference between foreign policy violations and hypocrisy. Which, again, hypocrisy is just when a nation isn't necessarily violating their foreign policy, but is slightly bending it. Right? They're acting in a certain way, but their laws state that that it's fine to act in a certain way, but it's hypocritical that they have multiple stances on multiple things. And it's not a violation per se, but it's more like them being two-faced, for example, other than them actively violating their own laws and their own policy. So I forgot to mention this earlier, but after each right reply, the delegate who, let's say I am bringing up a right to reply on Randero, for example. When I bring up the right to reply, after I get my time to speak and my time to explain what the right to reply is based, like what that right to reply is, Randero will get an inherent response. In his inherent response, all he has to do is defend himself. He has to say, Your Honor, I haven't done anything wrong here because of reason A, B, C. Right? And that's all you need to do. All you need to do is defend your stance and tell me why that right reply doesn't stand, why you didn't violate your foreign policy, why you didn't make a factual error, why you didn't infringe on someone else's sovereignty. But that's basically how foreign policy violations work. Then factual errors. Factual errors is quite simple, but it's basically when a delegate makes a mistake in regards to, let's say, a number or a year that that either them or another nation has done, signed something or gone to war or something like that. It's basically when you find an issue with a fact or a statistic that a delegate has brought out. Thirdly, and this is probably the trickiest one, infringements of sovereignty. Infringements of sovereignty are basically a delegate's way of defending their own nation when there's slander being pointed out against them. For example, if the delegate of Russia were to call, a better example would be if, for example, the delegate of USA calls all Arabic nations terrorists. In that instance, that is a direct insult to the nation and a direct insult to the state and the governing bodies within that nation. At that point, it is it is a foreign policy. It is an infringement of sovereignty because that nation is actively being insulted and their actions are being criticized. But there's other examples of infringement of sovereignty beyond just like being told that like being insulted. There's also when other nations actively intervene themselves within the sovereign territory of a nation without asking for permission. What that looks like, for example, is, let's say there's a conflict going within, I'm going to use the example of Sudan, but in the instance of the conflict in Sudan, let's say the delegate of USA says that they're going to send troops to Sudan and they're going to handle the problem for themselves, similar to the way that they intervened in Afghanistan. That is a violation of their sovereignty, because now you are entering sovereign soils. You are entering the sovereign soils of Sudan without necessarily asking the Sudanese government if they necessarily are okay with you entering the nation, right? Again, that is an infringement of sovereignty. Right? So you need to be careful when you think about like these things and how you bring them up, etc. But just keep that in mind and be like a bit careful when you're bringing these things up, right? Okay, the next point then, point of parliamentary inquiry. This you probably should ask, especially if you're a novice and you don't know much about like parliamentary procedure, or if this workshop goes extremely well, you probably won't have to ask. But just in case you do have any questions regarding parliamentary procedure and like what to do, what's happening now, how you bring up certain points, when you bring up certain points, all these things, all you need to do is raise your placard and say point of parliamentary inquiry. The chair will and they have to accept and they have to answer your question. But yeah, that's quite a simple one. Then the fifth one, point of personal privilege. Point of personal privilege is something that every delegate has to do. So it can be just simple questions such as uh, asking another delegate to be more audible, or it can be asking another delegate to rephrase, or basically, let's say a delegate uses a lot of acronyms in their question, in their POIs. The delegate can be point of personal privilege. Can the delegate who asked me the question not use acronyms or be more concise or rephrase, etc. But it can also be much simpler things such as going to the toilet or like asking to approach the head table. Something it's basically questions you ask regarding personal matters, as I've stated, things like audibility, etc. Point of uh, Another thing I missed regarding points of personal privilege is in the instance that there is a speech that you can't really hear because there's like, let's say a delegate is being very quiet and you can't really hear this delegate. In that instance, you bring up the point of personal privilege in the middle of the speech. It is very important that you understand that, like throughout SLMUN, you are not allowed to interrupt anyone while they're speaking, especially the head table and other delegates when they're speaking. But however, when it comes to points of personal privilege, in the instance that it is a like audibility issue, please feel free the second you are unable to hear the other delegate to raise your placard and like basically say that you're on a point of personal privilege, the delegate isn't audible, we can't hear what they're saying. In that instance, the chair will either tell the delegate to restart their speech or be a lot louder for the remaining part of their speech. The next one is then the point of order. And this is when the head table makes a mistake regarding procedure. Let's say the head table forgets to vote on a certain matter, or they go ahead on voting without necessarily asking the delegates for permission to move on, right? So like, what I mean by permission to move on is like voting and like seconds and objections. But that's another thing you should keep in mind, that if and when the chairs do make a mistake, you raise a point of order and you basically it's something that occurs only between the two chairs, the delegate and the chairs, and you say you're on a point of order. I believe you forgot to, the delegate believes you may have bypassed a certain voting procedure, etc. But it's basically to point out errors that the head table makes. But don't worry, it's very unlikely to occur in reality. But yeah, around there we can take over. Okay. Um. Oh, yeah. Could you go on to the next slide?
Yeah, sure.
Right. Moderator caucus topics. So after you discuss, wait, oh, never mind. The next part. Okay. Uh, wait, can you further back? Further back. Yes. The slide before that, procedure 2. Yes. Okay. So basically, the second part of procedure then is after you've already discussed working papers, the head table will open the floor again for other motions. And this is when you raise a motion to move into discussing moderator caucus topics. Um, so I'm sure a lot of you know that you already have to. So one of the 3 documents then I mentioned earlier that you need to submit before committee is you need to submit pre-mods as well. Pre-mods are basically pre-moderated caucus topics, which you submit ahead of time. But in the instance that the head table does open the floor for moderated caucus topics, all you need to do is write them down on like a piece of paper and submit them in chit form. Then the head table will discuss amongst themselves, and they will recognize a specific moderated caucus topic which they believe to be like something that should be discussed within committee. Once that moderated caucus topic is recognized, the delegate, if the chairs believe that if the moderated caucus topic is complicated enough that it does need to actually be like discussed in heavily, in that regards, then we will be allowing the delegate like probably like 20 to 30 seconds to explain what the moderated caucus topic is, and just explain the main aspects of it without giving their speech, right? So this will be the delegate that submits the moderated caucus topic. Then the committee goes on to vote on whether the moderated caucus topic should be discussed. Again, this is a procedural vote, so you must vote either for or against. So in the instance that there is an objection, and there's, again, as mentioned here, there's only 2 grounds for you to object. Either it has already been discussed or it is out of committee mandate. In the instance that this comes up, there will be a speech for and a speech against, and then committee will vote again after this, right? Once the moderated caucus topic is passed, assuming that there is a majority that is reached, in that instance, then the head table will ask the delegate who proposed the moderated caucus topic to set a time frame and a number of speakers. Uh, Again, here the delegate has a few options. Either the delegate can assign themselves, like basically mention a number of speakers and a time frame up to their discretion, or preferably they can say up to the discretion of the head table, and the head table will decide on their behalf how many speeches, how long. After that, all that the head table will then grant the first speech, the delegate who proposed it, and then all other speeches. The head table will open the floor for delegates who want to speak on this moderated caucus topic, and basically discuss basically then recognize multiple delegates to speak on this moderated caucus topic for the same amount of time throughout. Um, I forgot to mention what exactly moderated caucus topics are, but I assume that at the physical workshops we've already covered this. But just for those who weren't exactly sure, moderated caucus topics are basically you have the larger topic, right? And a moderated caucus topic is a smaller part of that larger topic, which you now break down. So it's imagine the larger topic is one huge war, right? There's different stances and there's different ways to look at a certain conflict like that. A moderated caucus topic will be taking into example one of those specific stances, one of those specific problems that exist within the larger problem, and you'll be discussing that. So within the multiple speakers that you have within a moderated caucus topic, you will have delegates bringing up solutions, and you will have delegates bringing up different types of proposals on how to solve the matter at hand, right? So that's basically what a moderated caucus topic is. It's just a smaller topic within the larger topic that we as uh, so within the UN and within MUN, we use this as a way of better dealing with the topic as a whole, because it's a lot easier to completely solve smaller constituent parts of the problem rather than trying to take the whole thing at once, right? And it's just our way of breaking it down and discussing solutions for each and every part of it. But yes, that's basically it on moderated Cox topics. On the next slide. Wait, back. Yeah, okay.
All right. Thank you so much, Himanshu. Hold on. All right, guys. So first and foremost, let's kind of move on to working papers, right? So you might be asking, or you might be thinking, what exactly is a working paper, right? In very simple terms, a working paper is basically a document that highlights you and your respective countries' problems and solutions regarding the topic at hand. So let me give you an example. For example, let's say we're back in 2021. We're discussing one of the major, or rather the biggest issues of the world right now, which is COVID-19. So the topic can be something like discussing the emergence of a global threat known as COVID-19 and its implications um, on global health as a whole, right? Something like that. So let's just simply think of it as the COVID-19 issue. So let's say you are representing the delegate of France, right? Let's say you are the delegate of France. You're representing the nation of France, right? As the nation of France, in your working paper, you are going to highlight what the nation of France believes are the major issues regarding COVID 19 and also the major solutions that you have in order to combat such issues, right? So, guys, if you will pay attention to the screen right now, this is essentially what a working paper would look like in essence, right? So, you have obviously the topic, which will be, let's say, in this case, is COVID 19, the issue of COVID 19, and your country is France this time. Now, what you see as preambulatory clause is, in very simple terms, the definition of problem, right? So I was talking about problems earlier, right? Preambulatory clauses are essentially what we know as problems. So, for an example, let's say, okay, forget what you see right now as a preambulatory clause. We are talking about COVID-19, right? So, off the top of my head, one preambulatory clause can be alarmed by the global health issues caused by COVID 19. And those health issues can be things like, obviously, okay, I'm not going to go too much into this. I'm not too sure of the very specifics with regards to how exactly COVID-19 affected like us in the scientific approach, but in a very simple sense, think of it as the issues that were caused by COVID-19. So, for an example, it caused issues of health. You know, there were several symptoms of COVID-19 that people faced. People ended up losing their lives over it. So, it essentially became a very fatal disease. Another thing is that it basically called for lockdowns within the area, and as such, that caused basically economic recessions and so on and so forth. It affected um, businesses and so on and so forth, right? So that all of those problems, ladies and gentlemen, is what will come under a preambulatory clause. And specifically, what your country believes, what your country thinks with regards to what may be an issue as per the topic, right? So, why I highlighted on that point, guys, is because you need to understand something known as foreign policy, right? And this was something that was briefly discussed about. Not briefly, actually. Himanshu went pretty much well into detail about it, right? But foreign policy is very important because you need to understand what your country represents. What your country represents, what your country believes is, in very simple terms, foreign policy, right? And I'm going to get on to that a little bit more in operative clauses. But in very simple terms, what your country believes also needs to be very much represented within this working paper, as you can see, right? So let's take the operative clause. Operative clause 1 by the delegate of Germany. That operative clause has to be relevant and has to be a part of the delegate of Germany's foreign policy. It needs to be part of what Germany believes as a whole, right? But now let me get into what exactly operative clauses are. So, very simple terms, guys, preambulatory clauses are problems, very simply, right? Next up is operative clauses, right? So, operative clauses, ladies and gentlemen, is very simply solutions to the topic at the end of the day, right? So, let's say, again, let's take the COVID-19 issue. A solution, again, that comes off the top of my head is initiating research into mRNA vaccines. And essentially, those are the vaccine technologies that were used in all of the vaccines that we got to prevent us from getting COVID-19. So that is a solution. That is a general solution that literally almost all of the countries in the world implemented during the times of COVID-19, right? So, for an example, some people might have gotten the Pfizer vaccine, the AstraZeneca vaccine, the Moderna vaccine, the Johnson Johnson vaccine. Those all come under that one solution of implementing research and subsidizing production into vaccine technologies like mRNA. Right? So, ladies and gentlemen, operative clauses are solutions, and specifically your country's solutions with regards to the topic. Okay. And yeah, that's basically it with regards to a working paper. And but just know that when you are phrasing your working paper, it is very important that you note that the very first wording of each clause. For an example, let's take preambulatory clause 1, addressing. As you guys can see, there are very specific key terms in each of these clauses that are very essential in actually forming the proper sentencing that's used in working papers, right? So, for an example, operative clause 1, the very first wording is improving. Operative clause 2, encourages. Operative clause 3, calls upon. Like that, ladies and gentlemen, there are very specific wordings that you must use before you start the sentence for each and every clause that's used. Okay, and that is something that you guys will be able to access in the SLMian delegate manual. So check that out if you want to know what the proper wordings are and to formulate your sentences properly. Okay, so that is essentially working papers, and I hope everyone can understand essentially what that was. Yeah, so actually here it is. So you guys can reference it for later. This is what I was talking about with regards to the first few words of the operative clauses. Sorry, of all the clauses that you need to use, specifically the operative clauses. So there's several wordings you can use, but you must use at least one of these wordings before you start the operative clause. Okay. So do you all remember operative clause 2 in that working paper said encourages? Encourages is right here. Okay. So you can use any of these. So guys, that's basically working papers. In summary, it's just a document that highlights your country's problems and their solutions regarding those problems relating to the topic at hand, very simply. Okay. And of course, make sure you word each and every one of those clauses very carefully. Y'all can check that out on the delegate manual. It's all there. Okay. Now, to get into what comes after working papers. So first and foremost, ladies and gentlemen, what we have is working papers. Then, as my co-chair discussed before, we have mods. And right after that, we have something known as unmoderated caucus. So I'll quickly explain this point because it's not too much. So, ladies and gentlemen, unmoderated caucus is essentially, it's right after moderated caucus. It's right after what Himanshu was discussing earlier with regards to subtopics. Okay. So unmoderated caucuses are essentially, in very simple terms, it's kind of like the group project that you get to do, but in MUN. I know it's kind of exciting, right? It's honestly, it's kind of like the area where everyone just comes together, plans together, works together, and in a way, it's kind of like a bonding project in a small sense. But obviously, there's a reason why we are going into such a group project, right? And I'll get on to exactly why that is. But right after moderated caucus, we move into a new motion known as unmoderated caucus. So the whole point of an unmoderated caucus is to essentially divide up the entire committee, all of the people in the committee, into two or more groups, right? And those groups are known as blocks. So this is an interesting analogy. I'll give you guys an analogy, right? An interesting analogy that I thought of a little while ago with regards to how unmod happens in real life is, for an example, if you guys remember during school and so on and so forth, after after the bell rings for interval and you guys get to go into interval, what happens is you guys divide up into different groups, right? Like you all don't all sit and wait in one class, right? What you guys do is essentially you divide up into different friend groups, right? In And you're like divide up into friend groups because you guys, you're friends, you like to talk with each other, you want to know more about each other, you want to discuss things with each other. I get it, been there, right? So in very simple terms, that's what happens here in unmod. It's basically I wouldn't say it's an actual interval, but it's a period where you guys divide up into 2 or 3 maximum groups where you essentially, yeah, so you divide into 2 groups where you guys have a common goal, in very simple terms. And that common goal, ladies and gentlemen, is something that we know as a resolution, right? Which I'll be getting into a little bit later. But in very simple terms, a resolution is like a group working paper. Yeah, in very simple terms, it's a group working paper. In very simple terms, a resolution is a group working paper, and each group in unmod has to develop that resolution. I hope that makes sense to you all, right? So let me go back a little bit, right? So you guys, what you do is in unmod you divide into 2 or more groups, and those groups are called blocks, right? And in those blocks, the whole point of you forming those blocks is to create something called a resolution. And a resolution is basically a group document that highlights your problems and solutions, just like a working paper. Except it's by one entire group. It's by one entire block, right? So I hope that makes sense to you. Two blocks divided, two separate solutions divided. Okay. Now, how exactly do you divide into those two groups? How do you divide into those specific groups? Well, unfortunately, I know I mentioned that, there's the analogy of going to be with your friends, dividing into groups where you're with your friends. Unfortunately, in MUN, that might not always be the best way of dividing into different blocks, right? Now, of course, you can divide into blocks where you're with your very close allies. So, for an example, those close allies can be based on your geographic location. So, if I were to give you a real world example, the European Union, right? A lot of countries within the European Union often have very similar policies, and therefore they are kind of interconnected, and therefore they are allies, right? So in a way, they are basically like, in very simple terms, they're basically like friends, if you would, and they divide into blocks. But the reason why they are friends is because they are allies. And the reason why they're allies is because they have similar policies, right? But as I was saying before, you can divide into different blocks based on your geographic location. However, that's not always the best way into deciding what exactly the best block is for you. So then there's the second option, which is with regards to your foreign policy. This is a very important thing to consider. So when you're dividing into two different groups, it's very important that you stick to your foreign policy relating to that group, right? So I'll give you an example again. Let's say so you guys know that Russia and USA, right? Let's take Russia and USA. Have they ever been friends, if you would? Have they ever been allies? No, right? There have been like very, very few cases in which they've been allies, right? As of now, they certainly aren't allies by any means. But and actually for that reason, they will never exactly, or rather in most cases, they will not be in the same group together. They won't be in the same block together because they're not allies. They don't have similar foreign policies. They don't have similar beliefs at the end of the day. So because of that, people, meaning you guys, delegates will divide into two different blocks based on their general foreign policy and what the entire group's general foreign policy is. Okay. And another way in which you can divide into blocks is by the organizations that your country is a part of. So I mentioned the EU, right? There's a major reason why a lot of the EU nations are always together in groups. And that's because they have very similar policies, but that's also because they are part of one bigger organization that's on top of them. And in this case, that would be the EU, or rather, an organization that they are part of, right? So the EU is a part of, apologies, the countries like Switzerland, Sweden, and like all of those nations in Europe, or most of them, are part of the European Union. And as such, they are usually in one block. And the other block are other nations who aren't exactly a part of the EU, but who are part of other organizations or have other or contrasting foreign policies, right? So that's basically how you divide into blocks. A very simple summary is that you guys divide into different blocks, different groups, and you create what we know as resolutions, which are very simply group solutions. Very simply, right? Group working papers. Okay. Now let's get on to what exactly is a resolution, what exactly is discussed in a resolution, right? So a resolution, ladies and gentlemen, is, like I said before, a group working paper, right? So the four main elements of a resolution, as you guys can see, are the heading, sponsors and signatory, the preambulatory clauses, and the operative clauses. So the heading is essentially what resolution you are representing. Very simply, what resolution you are representing. So, you know how I said there are two different blocks? Well, those blocks develop two different resolutions. And the very first resolution that's discussed, resolution that's discussed is what we know as resolution 1, or you can also known as 01/01. But let's just call it 1, resolution 1. Okay. And then the other block, the other resolution is resolution 2. Okay. So the heading will highlight which resolution is being discussed. So it can either be resolution 1 or resolution 2. Okay. So that's first and foremost, that's the heading. Secondly, sponsors and signatories. So guys, usually when you're in a group, we usually kind of elect sort of like a leader, right? We elect a leader. We elect someone to represent all of us, right? I mean, that's basically what happens in sports clubs. You guys have a captain. You have a captain for teams, and that captain represents the entire team, right? So if any of y'all do football, basketball, anything of that sort, you'll kind of like have a captain, right? I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I might have mistakenly said that. My apologies. Sorry about that. I might have angered some major basketball fans in this meeting. But in many team sports, you have a leader, essentially. You have a captain, right? And that's essentially what a sponsor is. Except a sponsor, obviously, a sponsor is the lead of the resolution, right? But in MUN, in specifically SLMUN, our procedure allows for a minimum of at least 2 leaders, in this case, also known as sponsors. So there can only be 2 sponsors per a resolution, minimum. So there can be a maximum of 3, but there has to be at least 2 sponsors per resolution. 2 sponsors, 2 leaders per a resolution. So 2 sponsors for resolution 1, 2 sponsors for resolution 2. Now I know I mentioned it's a group project, right? And of course it is, right? But how exactly are y'all involved if there are only 2 people to represent the entire group? Well, that comes to my next point, which is with regards to signatories. Signatories, in very simple terms, are people who are a part of the resolution but don't necessarily represent it, right? So that means a signatory is someone who contributed to the resolution, to the development of the resolution, but is not the main person representing it, right? So there are people who represent it, aka the sponsors, and there are people who are a part of it but aren't necessarily representing it as a whole. Okay, so the people who lead it are sponsors, the people who are part of it and contribute are signatories, but they're also the people who don't necessarily represent it, right? Who aren't like the main people who if you essentially represent it, right? So that's part 2. That's element 2 of the resolution. Element 3 is preambulatory clauses. Now, guess what? We heard of that before. Preambulatory clauses are very simply problems. So that means your group, all of the problems that your block wants to talk about, your resolution wants to talk about, will be addressed in preambulatory clauses. And then finally, the fourth part, which is operative clauses, right? Operative clauses, ladies and gentlemen, is with regards to solutions, right? Now I'm going to show you what a resolution looks like. But in your mind, what I want you all to do right now is picture a working paper, but done by a group instead of just you as a delegate. Okay. So I'm going to show you right now. Ladies and gentlemen, that is essentially what a resolution is, right? So, first and foremost, you have the topic, and above that, you'll actually also have which resolution you are. But again, it actually no, that depends on certain things, but we'll not get into that. But essentially, we have the heading, which is the topic, right? Then we have the sponsors and signatories, like I talked about earlier, and then we have the preambulatory clauses, which are the problems, and finally we have the operative clauses, which are the solutions. Okay, so again, the wordings are pretty much the same as the working paper. So keep in mind that you have to word it accordingly, just like a working paper. But this is essentially what a resolution looks like. It's very simply a group working paper. That's it. Okay. So what will happen during unmod is that you guys divide into two different blocks, and those two different blocks will be given that time to develop resolutions like this, to develop resolutions to solve the topic at hand. That's simply it. And after unmod, we'll be getting into what exactly we'll be getting into resolution debate. How exactly this resolution is debated on, how it's addressed. And that will be addressed by Himanshu. Right.
Okay, so resolution debate works like this. So we first go with the very first like submission. So whichever and I sorry, before I get on to that, I think there's something Randhir might have missed, and it's that when it comes to working papers and resolutions, you have to be very, very careful about punctuation. Okay. The reason why we call these clauses and we don't call them sentences is because, as most of you know, clauses are basically parts of a sentence. So, an entire resolution should only have one full stop. It is so inherently speaking, like when a head table sees a full stop, we stop reading at that point because ideally there should only be one full stop at the very, very end of the entire resolution or working paper. Besides that, there should only be things like semicolons and punctuation marks, and there shouldn't be anything else. Like there shouldn't be full stops or anything else in between. But that's just something else. So resolution debate. So the first, uh, like the first block to submit the resolution, will name the resolution 01/001, right? And you like you can obviously ask your chairs about things like naming conventions if you don't really understand it now, but the point of it is that that is how resolutions within the UN themselves are worded. But that resolution then will, so that resolution will then be presented by the sponsor nations of that resolution. So they will be granted a combined 3 minutes to submit their, to basically present the entire resolution to the House. And after that speech is had, you then have POIs, right? And POIs are asked. Again, it's the same as before when it came to working papers. The delegates can say any and all. The delegates can say a limited amount. It's up to the delegates. After the discussion of that, you again have things like statements, right replies. So when it comes to resolutions, it's actually very interesting in regards to things like right replies. If there are right replies identified, like there can be right replies identified within the resolution itself and within the responses that they give to things like POIs. This is very important, and actually the potential risk of being a sponsor nation is because now you are sticking your head out. What I mean by this is this. What I mean by this is that when you become a sponsor nation, you inherently take complete and all responsibility for that resolution. So any right to apply any foreign policy violations to your country's foreign policy that exist within the resolution immediately can be brought out by other delegates within the committee, right? So keep that in mind. So after we have all the POIs, the statements, the right replies, We then move on to the amendments. Amendments can be submitted by both the delegates, like the rest of the committee, as well as like the sponsor nations themselves, right? So amendments are basically, as I'm sure you already understand, amendments uh, solve the problem of like if you notice that there's anything wrong with the resolution, you can fix it. You can fix it by doing a few things. Firstly, you can propose a additional operative clause to basically fix or like close a hole that is exists within that specific resolution. The second thing you can do is um, strike off operative clauses, uh, or strike off sub clauses in operative clauses. And basically, so that's if you believe that a specific operative clause is either problematic or violates foreign policy or something like that. The third way you can amend is you amend a specific part of a existing operative clause. Either you change the wording, or you can add a specific like subclause to a currently existing operative clause. So those are like the three main ways that amendments like can be submitted, right? And you write these down in pieces of in chit form, and you submit it to the head table, right? Similar to how you would submit moderate caucus topics within committee, you write it down and you give it to the head table, and then the head table decides which amendments are to be discussed. There's two types of amendments then. You have friendly amendments and you have unfriendly amendments. It doesn't mean that like the delegates who are submitting it decide whether it's unfriendly or friendly. It's up to the sponsor nations. If the sponsor nations deem like a amendment unfriendly or friendly, it's due to a couple of reasons. The first reason is that it violates their foreign policy. The second reason, and because if it violates their foreign policy, they don't want to be accepting these sorts of things, right? They don't want to be accepting like amendments that violate their own foreign policy. The second reason is that in the instance that you accept such a so like in the instance that you are, let's say, striking off like multiple operative clauses, the sponsor nations might deem that unnecessary, or they might like either striking off or adding operative clauses. They might deem that unnecessary, or they might deem that like problematic for the sake of the resolution. But then like so it's completely up to the sponsor nation, and it's not up to anyone else in committee whether a amendment is friendly or unfriendly. But if the amendment is friendly, and in the instance that like in a large majority of instances when sponsor nations themselves propose amendments to fix problems within their own resolution, it's generally friendly. However, in the instance that it's not friendly, we go into a few steps. So firstly, we discuss the amendment. How does this work? We have speeches for and against. We have speeches for and against the amendments, right? So we have a speech by the nation, so like by either one of the sponsor nations or by another delegating committee. The head table will decide based off like open the floor for speeches for and against. So either a sponsor nation or another delegate within committee will speak against, and the delegate that proposes it will speak for, right? And then after those speeches are completed, we'll be moving on into voting upon these amendments. But yeah, that's basically how the amendment section works. But before we go into amendments, there's this thing called speeches for and against. Speeches for and against the resolution work simply like this. How it works is after we've discussed POIs, we open the floor for speeches for and against, where we have like multiple speeches for and multiple speeches against, where any delegate, preferably not the sponsor nations themselves, can speak for and can speak against the resolution. Note that signatory is like, so let's say I am a signatory in block 1 and they're discussing resolution 1. It is not imperative that I inherently have to speak for resolution 1. I can speak even against resolution 1 if I believe that it's problematic enough. But that's up to you, right? So yeah, but speeches for and against that, it's just generally ways that delegates can voice their concerns beyond things like POIs and beyond things like statements. After amendments and speeches for and against, Then we move on to open debate. But okay, to move on to open debate, you need to then discuss both resolutions. So after you've discussed the first resolution, you raise a motion to table discussion and move on to this discussion of the second resolution, which you then do the same thing again. Like you repeat the entire procedure that I've mentioned, where you split into your blocks, you ask POIs, you give the speeches for and against, you discuss amendments, then you move on to open debate, right? So in open debate, it's free reign, right? You can talk about both resolutions. This is the only place that you can really compare both resolutions per se, where you can draw direct conclusions, saying direct comparisons, where you say, okay, this resolution does this resolution does this, vote this resolution, vote this resolution, etc. Right? So that's basically how it works. You discuss both resolutions, and this is open to anyone in committee. And after that, uh, after you've discussed both resolutions, you then move on to voting, right? And this is the final part of MUN, like this is the final part of the day, right? Like, of conference, right? Where you basically vote on the entire resolution and you decide which resolution at the end of the day passes. So as it states here, you firstly ask, you start with the first resolution. You say, you call for votes for, against, and abstaining. An important, so again, sponsors are allowed to vote, right? So the thing is this, there needs to be at least a 2/3 majority, at least. That is the very minimum that you can have within a committee, and like for a resolution to pass, right? If the first resolution passes, in that instance, we don't go on to voting on the second resolution. That resolution is scrapped, and we only pass the first resolution, right? At SLMUN, we don't pass multiple resolutions. We only pass one resolution, and that is in the priority of which resolution is submitted first. So make sure that your resolutions are submitted on time, and make sure to be like fast with like submission of resolutions, right? So that's important. In the instance that the first resolution doesn't pass, obviously you move on to voting on the second resolution, and so on, right? After a resolution has or has not been passed, you then open the floor for motions again to adjourn session. As I'm sure you understand, this is the very last motion of the day. You adjourn session. Conference for this year is at least done, right? So but that's how resolution voting and resolution debate works. Right. So the next thing is the foreign policy statement. And the foreign policy statement is an interesting thing because it is something that we at SLMUN don't place the highest priority to, but it is still one of the documents that you need to submit. So not too much unlike the working paper, it is a document that basically inculcates your foreign policy and like basically encapsulates the solutions that you propose, the solutions that you've already done, and etc. And basically you just identify problems, solutions, but this is in an essay form. It is not in a it is not in the form of a resolution or a working paper. It is in the form of like just paragraphs and bodies of text. So don't worry about the whole full stop thing I mentioned earlier. Don't worry about that for your foreign policy statement. Yeah, so it basically highlights the stance of the topic, and it's basically a position paper where it establishes identity and sets out like agenda for you to move on in committee. The difference between a foreign policy statement and a working paper is that a working paper is something that needs to be acceptable to at least majority of the nations within committee, whereas like so it's a presentation of the solutions that you propose to the identified problems, the problems that you identify, right? Whereas a foreign policy statement is a purely personal thing, right? It's not something that we concern ourselves about regarding like other countries as much. It's purely about your country, your stance, your agenda, etc., right? But whereas a working paper, you need to also consider things like feasibility of these solutions, things like how you're going to integrate this and basically make it acceptable to multiple nations. Whereas in a foreign policy statement, you're more talking about like the stances of your own nation and your own nation's agenda. But I think there's an example foreign policy statement here. Okay, never mind. Yeah, go back. Yes. So in general, this is a like highly recommended structure because it is a structure which we at SLMM believe works very well. But you basically split it up into three important questions. What is my delegate? What is the delegate's country? Sorry, does the delegate's country support this topic? This is a simple yes or no question. It shouldn't take too many words. Note that when it comes to an FPS, you have a very tight word limit. It's generally less than 1,000 words. So you have to be making sure that you're not wasting too many words on unnecessary things. The first question should be the question you write the least about, right? So this is what your country, does your country support this, the topic? Simple yes or no, right? In general, it is often a yes, but just keep in mind that in certain instances, it could be a no. What has the country done to support this topic in accordance with your stance? What we mean by this is like that in the past, well, most committees will often have topics which to some extent have already been discussed. Take, for example, like UNESCO, for example. We at UNESCO are talking about a topic of repatriation for like the conference topic. The topic of repatriation and the returning of cultural heritage has been a topic that has been long debated, and countries have certain stances regarding returning cultural heritage back to their countries, right? So it is often that not only in UNESCO but all committees, like for example, UNFCCC, where they have common stances on certain matters and certain things. Sorry about that. But basically, your nation has more likely than not done something in relation to the topic, and either to support or go against the topic, right? In the instance that your nation has in fact gone against the topic, right, and doesn't support the topic. But basically here you just list out, well, not list out per se, but you explain the different things that your country has done in the past and how their past impacts their present currently. But the idea is that the third question is then what your country plans to do in the future, right? And the understanding here is that when it comes to the matter of like a lot of these things, right, when like especially in regards to like dealing with climate change and all these things, this is where your creativity comes in. This is where you as a delegate need to think a bit more, and when you can even take it, like when you have a lot of similarity between your working papers and your foreign policy statements. Sorry, but basically in this part, and I recommend you spend the most amount of time thinking about this part, you come up with the solutions that you think your country can implement either nationally or even internationally to solve the particular problem at hand in accordance with to your foreign policy, right? So you can like as Randir stated earlier, like in your working paper, you propose solutions to different problems. Similarly, in the third question, you can propose either the same solutions or different solutions, but now you're proposing them in essay form, right? You're proposing them in paragraphs rather than like clauses, right? So keep that in mind, that this is where a lot of your creativity and your independent thought comes in, because you can't just like depend on what your country has already done. And it's not purely based off research, but it's also based off how you apply that research and how you apply that past knowledge of your nation onto like the topic of like solving the problem in the future, right? Because you need to identify that there are certain loopholes and etc. that you need to close eventually. But yes, that's basically it for foreign policy statements. note that it's not the most important thing, but it is very important for you as a delegate to identify. But yeah, lastly, research. And
Yeah. Wait. Yeah. So, wait, sorry, my camera went off. All right, guys. So, yeah. So, with regards to research, we'll quickly get on to what exactly, or rather, how exactly you could research, right? So, other than first and foremost reading the conference materials, now obviously for every single committee that you are part of, whether it be UNESCO, whether it be Union for the Mediterranean, whether it be WHA, any of the other committees, GA3, whatever committee you are in, you will have what you know as a study guide. And that study guide will essentially give you a brief introduction, if you would, or a brief understanding of what is to be discussed regarding the topics that are given to you, right? So the study guides will have pretty much information on the practice debates. It has information on practically everything, but it's a very simple guide to you. That's why it's called study guide, and it'll help you essentially understand everything with regards to your specific committee and the topics to be discussed within conference. Right now, the next step that you can take towards actually understanding everything and researching MUN is understanding how exactly the UN works. Right. So as I stated before, in Model United Nations, we simply simulate what the United Nations is. So the better you understand the UN, the more you can put that research towards uh, MUN itself and towards conference and towards your research itself. So that can include, okay, how exactly was the UN created? Why was it created? What is the main document that is a part of the UN, which you guys might know as the UN Charter, right? There's so much information out there. There's so much information with regards to the United Nations that you guys can freely go through with regards to their own websites. The United Nations has several websites with regards to all of this information where you guys can go and check it out yourself and bring that kind of research after understanding it into conference, right? Then you can understand exactly understand what exactly your country does, right? So regarding a specific topic, you need to understand what does your country think, or what does it believe with regards to the topic. What has it done with regards to the topic? What do they plan to do with regards to the topic? That's essentially the few areas that the foreign policy statement identifies, which Himanshu was talking about earlier. Understand those key few components, and then you can move on to more about the actual committee's topic, right? So understand the committee topic. First and foremost, you got to understand what the UN is, understand the committee you're in, understand what country you represent, and obviously the topic of the committee itself, right? Then you need to research more into the specific details, like what do they believe, who do they ally with, what kind of projects do they plan to do, and so on and so forth, right? What organizations are they part of with regards to this research, right? But in my personal opinion, there are also specific ways in which you can research. And what I would do when I research, and this is something I do usually even when I research for specific committees, what I do is, ladies and gentlemen, I first and foremost understand what committee I'm a part of, right? What is the scope? What is the mandate of our committee, right? Then I move on to the topic that's being discussed. And usually the topic will have a few keywords that you must understand. So what I would do is I would take that topic, divide it into a few different parts, and then research on those parts individually and then add it all together. So let's say it's once again discussing the global concern of COVID-19 with special emphasis on global health, on protecting global health, right? The keywords in that topic includes COVID-19 first and foremost, and global health, protection of global health. So you can divide your areas of research into those 2 or 3 aspects, research on those aspects individually, and then add it all together. And when you divide up your research into those few aspects, you can branch out more towards those particular aspects. You can understand more, use more of that information, and when you do use more of that information, you can even consider those as subtopics. You can consider them as smaller aspects, and then even use that for something like moderated caucuses. That's honestly the beauty of research. The more and more you break down the topic, the more and more you can understand, talk about specific niches with regards to the topic, and even use that to your advantage in specific parts of procedure like moderated caucus. You'll be able to put more moderated caucus research as a result of breaking down the topic more. That is very simply what I do. And something that I would suggest as a chair is also under the UN system, there are also several conventions and treaties that relate to the UN and specifically the committee and topic at hand. You guys should definitely research on that. So when you get a topic, research on the relevant treaties and conventions regarding that topic to better understand the common protocols that exist that your nation and all of the allied nations have in common towards achieving the solution at hand, right? So that's what I would suggest with regards to MUN research. First and foremost, read through the study guide. That'll give you a good understanding of what you need to do. But and then you can also what I personally suggest is understand the committee, the U first and foremost, the UN, the committee, the scope of the mandate, then get the topic, break down the topic, understand more about the topic, then understand your country, your stance, what you have done, what you plan to do, and then move on to branching out, getting more niche into it. And finally, ladies and gentlemen, you'll have so much research that you quite frankly won't know what to do with it. Right. So that is basically everything covered right here, right now.
On there.